Before I share this life-changing story of betrayal and ultimate justice, please take a moment to subscribe to her true stories and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us bring you more real-life stories of courage, redemption, and finding your strength when the people closest to you fail you most. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when a woman finally decides she's had enough. I'm Amelia Cardoso, and at 67 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like after 42 years of marriage. I thought I understood the rhythm of a long partnership, the comfortable silences, the unspoken understanding, the way two people move around each other like dancers who've practiced the same routine for decades. I was wrong about all of it. The cancer diagnosis report arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by a FedEx driver who smiled apologetically as he handed me the thick manila envelope. I'd been expecting it. The follow-up to my mammogram had revealed suspicious shadows, and Dr. Martinez had warned me that additional testing would be needed. I remember standing in my kitchen, still wearing my gardening gloves, dirt under my fingernails from the tomatoes I'd been tending in our backyard. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting everything in that golden glow that makes ordinary moments feel sacred. If I'd known it would be the last ordinary moment of my old life, I might have paid more attention. The report was thick, filled with medical terminology that made my heart race, even though I didn't fully understand it all. But some words are unmistakable, even to a woman who'd spent her career managing our family business instead of studying medicine. Stage 2. Invasive ductal carcinoma. Treatment required immediately. Breast cancer. I set the report down on our kitchen table, the same oak table where we'd shared 42 years of meals, where our children had done homework, where we'd planned vacations and argued about bills and celebrated birthdays. It seemed fitting somehow that this news should land there too. And there it sat. For 1 week. My husband Richard walked past that table 6 times a day minimum. He ate his breakfast there every morning while reading the Wall Street Journal on his iPad. He sorted through mail there. He took phone calls for his consulting work while pacing around it. He even cleaned his reading glasses with the cloth placemat that sat right next to where I'd placed the report. But he never asked. Not once. Not, "What's this medical report, honey?" Not, "Is everything okay?" Not even, "Whose mail is this?" Richard acted like that report was invisible. Like it was part of the table's wood grain, something that had always been there and would always be there, requiring no attention or acknowledgement. For 7 days, I waited. I told myself he was busy. His consulting firm was in the middle of a major client acquisition. I told myself he was distracted. Our son Michael had just started his residency at Johns Hopkins, and Richard was worried about him, adjusting to the demanding schedule. I told myself he was waiting for me to bring it up first, giving me space to share when I was ready. But deep down, a cold truth was crystallizing in my chest like ice forming on a winter pond. Richard hadn't noticed because Richard wasn't looking. After 42 years of marriage, I had become as invisible to him as wallpaper. The realization hit me fully on day 7, when I came home from grocery shopping to find Richard's business partner Frank sitting at our kitchen table, spreading documents across its surface for an impromptu meeting. I watched in frozen silence as Frank casually moved my cancer diagnosis report aside to make room for their contracts, treating it like junk mail. Richard didn't even glance at it. That's when I knew. That's when the last thread of hope snapped, and something fundamental shifted inside me. I had spent 42 years building a life with a man who couldn't be bothered to notice when I was facing the fight of my life. Day 1. I placed the report on the table Tuesday morning. Richard came home from golf, walked right past it, and asked what was for dinner. Day 2. Richard ate breakfast while reading emails. The report was 6 inches from his orange juice glass. He complimented my scrambled eggs and left for the office without a word about the manila folder. Day 3. Our neighbor Mrs. Chun came over for coffee. She immediately noticed the report and asked if everything was okay. I made an excuse about routine paperwork, but her concern was more genuine in 30 seconds than my husband's had been in 48 hours. Day 4. Richard's sister called during dinner. He took the call at the kitchen table, spreading his notes around the report like it was part of the table surface. He talked for 20 minutes about their mother's retirement home situation while my diagnosis sat untouched beneath his elbow. Day 5. I moved the report to a different spot on the table, thinking maybe its location was the problem. Richard sat down for breakfast, moved it aside to make room for his newspaper, and never looked at it twice. Day 6. I considered just telling him, but something stubborn and hurt inside me rebelled. Why should I have to announce my own health crisis? Why couldn't the man I'd shared my life with notice that something was wrong? Day 7. Frank's visit. The final straw. That evening, after Frank left and Richard settled into his recliner to watch the news, I finally spoke. "Richard," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "there's something we need to discuss." He glanced up from his phone. "What's that, honey?" I walked to the kitchen table and picked up the report. "This has been sitting here for a week." He squinted at it like he'd never seen it before. "What is it?" "My cancer diagnosis." The words hung in the air between us. Richard's expression shifted from casual disinterest to confusion to something that might have been shock, but felt more like inconvenience. "Cancer," he repeated. "When did you? How long have you known?" "Since Tuesday." "The report's been on our kitchen table since Tuesday. You've walked past it approximately 42 times. He set down his phone and stood up, suddenly all attention and concern. But it was too late. 7 days too late. "Amelia, honey, why didn't you say something?" And there it was. The question that revealed everything. After 42 years of marriage, my husband expected me to announce my own health crises like items on a business agenda. He expected me to manage not just my own emotions, but his awareness of them. "I shouldn't have to," I said quietly. A husband who loves his wife notices when she's struggling. A partner who cares asks questions when medical reports appear on the kitchen table. "I've been distracted with work." "You're always distracted with work, Richard. But you know what?
So am I.
I work just as many hours as you do, handle just as many crises, carry just as much stress. But I still notice when you're upset. I still ask how your day was. I still see you." He reached for me then, but I stepped back. "What kind of cancer?" he asked. "What stage? What's the treatment plan?" "Now you want details?" "Of course I want details. You're my wife." "Am I?" The question surprised even me, because for the past week, I've felt more like a piece of furniture in your life. That night, Richard slept in our bed while I lay awake staring at the ceiling, cancer report finally in my hands instead of abandoned on the kitchen table. I read it cover to cover 3 times, learning the language of my own mortality while my husband snored peacefully beside me. By morning, I had made a decision that would change everything. The next few weeks revealed a pattern I'd been too close to see clearly before. Once my eyes were opened, I couldn't unsee it. Richard's newfound concern about my health lasted exactly 4 days. 4 days of asking how I was feeling, for days of offering to drive me to appointments, for days of remembering to say, "We'll get through this together." Then he was back to business as usual. When I mentioned I needed to start chemotherapy, he nodded sympathetically and then immediately launched into a story about Frank's wife's cousin who'd beaten cancer twice. When I explained that my treatment schedule would require me to reduce my hours at the office, he frowned and asked how we'd handle the Morrison account presentation. When I came home exhausted from my first chemo session, Richard was on a conference call in his study. He waved at me through the glass door, but didn't come out until the call ended 2 hours later. By then, I'd made dinner, eaten alone, and gone to bed. "How did it go today?" he asked, poking his head into our bedroom.
"Fine," I said.
Because what was the point of explaining the nausea, the bone-deep fatigue, the way the chemicals made everything taste like metal? He'd already missed the moment when I needed him most. But the real revelation came when I started paying attention to how our business actually functioned day to day. I began keeping a detailed log of every decision that crossed my desk, every client issue I resolved, every system I maintained. The results were staggering. In a typical week, I reviewed and approved all major expenditures, managed relationships with our 3 biggest clients, supervised our accounting and billing processes, coordinated between our 3 offices, handled HR issues for 37 employees, maintained our project management systems, oversaw quality control for all deliverables. Meanwhile, Richard attended client dinners, gave presentations using materials I prepared, played golf with potential clients, attended industry conferences, participated in networking events. Don't get me wrong, sales and relationship building are crucial to any business. But Richard had been doing the fun, visible parts while I handled the unglamorous work that actually kept our company running. And nobody knew. Not our employees, not our clients, not even our own children. In 40 years of marriage, I had become the invisible partner in every sense of the word. During my chemotherapy treatments, as I sat in that sterile room with poison dripping into my veins, I began conducting a quiet investigation into my own life and business. What I discovered shocked even me. Our company's financial records told a story Richard probably didn't even realize. Every major client we'd retained long-term had been secured through relationships I'd built and maintained. The Morrison account he was so worried about? I'd been their primary contact for 6 years. The Patterson Group, our biggest client? They'd specifically requested to work with me after their first consultation. I found emails dating back years where clients would write to Richard, but address their substantive questions to me. Please have Amelia review this proposal. Can Amelia join our next call? We'd like Amelia's input on the implementation timeline. Most shocking of all, I found correspondence between Richard and his business partner Frank about transitioning some of Amelia's responsibilities so I could focus on my health. They'd been planning to redistribute my work without ever asking me what I wanted or needed. They were already writing me out of the business I'd helped build, treating my cancer diagnosis as an excuse to push me toward retirement I'd never requested. As I sat in my oncologist's waiting room, bald from chemotherapy and wearing a scarf I'd bought online, I realized something profound. I wasn't just fighting cancer. I was fighting for my right to exist as a full person in my own life. That's when I started making calls. The first call was to Janet Morrison, the client Richard was so worried about losing during my treatment. I'd been managing the Morrison account for 6 years, and Janet and I had developed a professional friendship that went beyond typical client relationships. Amelia. Janet's voice was warm when she answered. How are you feeling? Richard mentioned you were dealing with some health issues. I'm managing, I said. Janet, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. If I weren't involved with your account anymore, what would happen? There was a pause. Well, to be frank, we'd probably look for a new consulting firm. You're the reason we've stayed with Cardoso and Associates for so long. Richard's nice enough, but you're the one who understands our business. I made 17 similar calls that week. To clients, to employees, to vendors we'd worked with for years. The responses were consistent. People worked with our company because they worked with me. But the call that changed everything was to my college roommate Linda, who'd gone into real estate and now specialized in high-end coastal properties. Linda, I said, hypothetically, if someone wanted to disappear from their old life and start over somewhere beautiful, where would you recommend? She laughed. Having a midlife crisis, are we? Something like that. Well, if I were starting over, I'd want to be somewhere I could watch the sunrise over the ocean every morning. There's something about that daily reminder that every day is a new beginning, That conversation planted a seed that grew rapidly. I started browsing real estate listings in coastal towns. Cape Cod, the Outer Banks, Myrtle Beach, Monterey. I told myself I was just dreaming, just giving my mind something beautiful to focus on during the harder moments of treatment. But then I found it. A weathered cedar-shingled cottage in Cannon Beach, Oregon, just 90 minutes from Portland, but a world away from my current life. It sat on a bluff overlooking Haystack Rock, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Pacific and a wraparound deck perfect for morning coffee and evening wine. The listing description read like poetry. Wake up to waves, fall asleep to the sound of the tide. This intimate cottage offers the perfect retreat for someone ready to embrace coastal living. I called the listing agent before I could talk myself out of it. The owner is motivated to sell, she explained. It's been a family vacation home, but they're relocating to the East Coast and want someone who'll love it as much as they have. I scheduled a viewing for the following week, telling Richard the First had a specialist appointment in the area. Which wasn't entirely a lie. I was consulting with a specialist about my future. The moment I stepped onto that deck and saw the endless expanse of ocean stretching to the horizon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. While standing on that deck in Cannon Beach, breathing in salt air and listening to waves crash against the rocks below, I made a call that would change everything. "Tom," I said when our accountant answered, "I need you to run some numbers for me." Tom Bradley had been handling our business and personal finances for 15 years. He was discreet, thorough, and loyal, exactly the kind of professional you want when you're about to make life-altering decisions. "What kind of numbers, Amelia?" "I want to know what would happen if I sold my stake in Cardoso and Associates. What would it be worth? What would be the tax implications? How quickly could it be done?" There was a pause. "Are you and Richard restructuring the business?" "Something like that." "Can you run the analysis without mentioning it to Richard? I want to understand all the options before we have any discussions." "Of course. Give me a few days." What Tom discovered was remarkable. Because I'd been so integral to the business operations, and because our client relationships were primarily built around my work, my stake in the company was worth far more than I'd realized. "Amelia," Tom said when he called back, "based on our client retention rates, revenue streams, and the value of your relationships, I'd estimate your portion of the business at somewhere between $2.80 and $3.2 million. I sat down hard on my kitchen chair, the same chair where I'd eaten breakfast for 20 years while Richard read his newspaper and ignored cancer reports. "That much. You've been the operational backbone of this company for 4 decades. You've built systems, relationships, and processes that would be incredibly expensive to replace. Any buyer would be paying for your expertise and your client base. And if I wanted to sell quickly, well, that would depend on finding the right buyer. But Amelia, are you sure you want to do this? This business is your life's work too." He was right. It was my life's work, but it was also my prison. That evening, I made another call, this time to Janet Morrison. "Janet, hypothetical question. If you could work with me directly without going through Cardoso and Associates, would you be interested?" "In a heartbeat," she said immediately. "Are you thinking of starting your own firm?" "Maybe. Would you follow me if I did?" "Absolutely. And I know at least 3 other companies who'd do the same. You're the best consultant we've ever worked with, Amelia. The question isn't whether we'd follow you, it's when you're ready for us to start." By the time I hung up, I had verbal commitments from 4 major clients to transfer their business to whatever new venture I might create. Between them, they represented about $1.8 million in annual revenue. I could start over. I could build something new, something that was entirely mine. But first, I had to extract myself from the old life that no longer fit. Over the next month, While Richard remained obliviously focused on his golf game and client dinners, I quietly orchestrated the most significant business transaction of my life. The buyer came through an unexpected source, one of our former employees, Marcus Chen, who'd left 3 years earlier to start his own consulting firm. Marcus had built a successful practice but was looking to expand rapidly, and he recognized the value of acquiring our client base and operational systems. "Mrs. Cardoso," Marcus said during our confidential meeting at a coffee shop across town, "I've always known you were the real force behind Cardoso and Associates. If you're willing to sell your stake and consult with me during the transition, I can offer you $3.1 million and guarantee positions for all current employees." What about Richard? Marcus was diplomatic but honest. Mr. Cardoso would be welcome to stay on in a client relations capacity, but the operational control would transfer to me. "To be frank, most of your clients have specifically asked to continue working with you. If you're not part of the new arrangement, we'd lose about 60% of the business." It was validation I hadn't realized I needed. After 40 years of being the invisible partner, someone finally saw my true value. The legal arrangements were complex but discreet. Tom helped me structure the sale to minimize tax implications, and my attorney ensured that everything was airtight. I would retain consulting agreements with 4 key clients who wanted to work with me independently, plus receive a lump sum payment for my ownership stake. Most importantly, I would be free. While these negotiations proceeded, I was also finalizing the purchase of the beach house. The owners accepted my offer, and we scheduled closing for the first week of December. Richard remained completely unaware of any of these developments. He'd gotten so comfortable with me handling everything that he'd stopped paying attention to the business details entirely. When I mentioned I'd been having meetings with Tom about year-end financial planning, he just nodded and asked me to handle whatever needed to be done. I was handling it all right, just not in the way he expected. On a crisp November morning, exactly 2 months after my cancer diagnosis report had sat ignored on our kitchen table, I finally told Richard the truth. Not about the cancer. We'd had those conversations, though they'd been largely focused on logistics and scheduling rather than emotions or support. The truth about everything else. "Richard," I said over breakfast, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from his iPad, where he'd been reading industry news. "What's that, honey?" "I've sold my stake in Cardoso and Associates." He blinked, clearly not processing the words. "You've what?" "I've sold my ownership share of our business. The transaction closes next week." His coffee mug hit the table hard enough to slosh liquid onto his precious iPad. "You've done what?" "Without discussing it with me? The way you didn't discuss moving my responsibilities to Frank when I started chemo?" That stopped him cold. His mouth opened and closed without sound. "I found the emails, Richard. I know you and Frank have been planning to phase me out of the business for my own good. So I've saved you the trouble." "Amelia, that's not. We were just trying to reduce your stress." "By taking away the work that gives my life meaning? By assuming I couldn't handle my own career decisions? By planning my retirement without asking me what I wanted?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen thousands of times over 4 decades of marriage. "Who did you sell to?" "Marcus Chen. He's buying the company and retaining all employees. You'll still have a job, though your role will be different." "Marcus Chen?" "That kid who used to work for us. That successful business owner who recognizes the value of what I built, yes." Richard stood up and began pacing around the kitchen, around the table where my cancer diagnosis had sat ignored for a week. "How much?" he asked finally. $3.1 million. He sat down hard.
Jesus, Amélia.
"I had no idea your share was worth that much." "No, you didn't. You had no idea about a lot of things. We need to discuss this. We need to make plans. That money is mine, Richard. My portion of the business, my client relationships, my 40 years of work. I've already made plans. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder, not unlike the medical report that had started all of this. I've purchased a house in Cannon Beach. I'm moving there next month. You're what? I'm starting over. I'm consulting independently with clients who actually value my work. I'm going to wake up every morning looking at the ocean and remember what it feels like to be truly alive. Richard stared at me like I'd announced I was joining the circus. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. What about us? What about our marriage? I looked at this man I'd shared my life with for 42 years, this man who'd walked past my cancer diagnosis 42 times without asking a single question, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even disappointment. Just emptiness. What marriage, Richard? When was the last time you asked me how I was feeling? When was the last time you noticed when I was upset? When was the last time you saw me as anything more than someone who handles the details of your life? That's not fair. Fair. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Fair would have been a husband who noticed when his wife was facing cancer. Fair would have been a partner who saw the value in what I contributed to our business. Fair would have been 42 years of being treated like an equal instead of an efficient employee. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden I tended for 20 years. Soon, I'd be looking at the ocean instead. I'm leaving next week, Richard. The house is already sold. Yes, I sold our house too. I've left you the information about your new role at the company. Tom has all the financial details you'll need. Amelia, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can. I turned back to face him. Richard, do you love me? Of course I love you. When was the last time you told me that? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Then opened it again. No words came. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams? My fears? My hopes for the future? Silence. When was the last time you really looked at me, Richard? Not just glanced my way when you needed something, but really saw me? He sat there, speechless, and I had my answer. The beach house was everything the photos had promised and more. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with windows overlooking the Pacific, and that incredible wraparound deck where I could watch the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold every morning. But the best part wasn't the house itself. It was the silence. For the first time in 42 years, my phone wasn't ringing constantly with business emergencies. No one was asking me to fix problems, handle crises, or manage details. I could sit on my deck with my morning coffee and listen to nothing but waves crashing against the rocks below. The moving process had been surprisingly smooth. I'd hired professionals to pack and transport my belongings, keeping only what I truly wanted for my new life. The rest, 40 years of accumulated stuff, went into storage or donation. I kept my grandmother's china, my collection of art books, the comfortable reading chair Richard had always complained was too worn to keep in the living room. I kept photos of our children and grandchildren, but not a single picture of Richard and me together. That chapter was closed. The house came partially furnished, which was perfect. I didn't want to recreate my old life in a new location. I wanted to create something entirely different. My first morning waking up in Cannon Beach, I sat on the deck in my pajamas and robe, watching the sun rise and feeling something I'd almost forgotten. Peace. My phone buzzed. A text message. Amelia, please call me.
We need to talk.
Richard. I deleted it without responding and turned my phone to silent mode. The second text came an hour later. I don't understand why you're doing this. Can we please discuss this like adults?
Delete.
The third. The business is falling apart without you. Marcus needs your help with the transition. I almost laughed. Now he understood what I'd been worth. By evening, I'd received 14 messages from Richard. I blocked his number. But Richard was nothing if not persistent. When I blocked his personal phone, he started calling from the office. When I blocked that number, he had our son Michael call me. Mom. Michael's voice was careful when I answered. Dad says you've moved to the beach? I have. It's beautiful here. He's really upset. He says you sold the business and the house without telling him. Michael, I appreciate that you're concerned about your father, but this is between him and me. But Mom, he's falling apart. He says he doesn't understand what happened. I sighed. What happened is that I spent 42 years being invisible in my own marriage. What happened is that your father walked past my cancer diagnosis report for a week without asking a single question about it.
What?
Mom, you have cancer? And there it was. Richard hadn't even told our children about my diagnosis. In 4 months of treatment, he never once mentioned to our son or daughter that I was fighting for my life. The treatment went well, and my prognosis is excellent. But yes, I was diagnosed with breast cancer in September. September? Mom, it's January. Why didn't anyone tell me? I assumed your father had. We've been dealing with it since September. There was a long pause. He never said a word. Sarah doesn't know either. Then maybe you should ask your father why he didn't think his children needed to know their mother was fighting cancer. After that conversation, the calls from Richard became even more frantic. But I'd learned something important. I didn't have to answer them.
While Richard was calling and texting and having our children call me, I was busy building something beautiful. My first independent consulting client was Janet Morrison, who followed through on her promise to work with me directly. Then came Patterson Group, then Wellington Industries, then Morrison Group. Within 6 weeks, I had more work than I could handle, all from clients who specifically wanted to work with me, not with some version of me filtered through a company structure. I set up a home office in the smallest bedroom, with a view of the ocean and a comfortable chair where I could take calls while watching seabirds dive for fish. The work was the same type I'd been doing for decades, but it felt completely different when I was doing it for myself. I joined a local yoga studio and discovered that I actually enjoyed physical exercise when it wasn't squeezed between business meetings and household management. I started taking long walks on the beach every morning, collecting shells and watching the tide change. I bought art supplies for the first time since college and set up an easel on the deck. My first painting was terrible, a clumsy attempt at capturing the sunset over Haystack Rock. But it was mine, created by my hands during time that belonged entirely to me. Most importantly, I made friends. Real friends, not the wives of Richard's business associates who'd included me in social events, because I came with him. At yoga, I met Linda, a retired teacher who'd moved to Cannon Beach after her husband died. At the farmer's market, I met Tom, a widower who ran a small organic farm and made me laugh with his stories about fighting raccoons for his tomatoes. These people knew me as Amelia, not as Richard's wife or the woman behind Cardoso and Associates. They liked me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. As spring turned to summer, Richard's attempts to contact me became increasingly desperate and creative. He sent flowers. I donated them to the local hospital. He sent letters. I returned them unopened. He had our daughter Sarah call, crying about how Daddy is so sad and doesn't understand what went wrong. I gently explained to Sarah about the cancer diagnosis that her father had never mentioned and suggested she ask him directly about his priorities. He even showed up at my beach house one Saturday morning in July. I was on my deck, painting a watercolor of the morning light on the waves, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the coastal pines that shielded my house from the road, I could see Richard's silver Mercedes, the same car he'd driven for 3 years, the same car I'd arranged the financing for, the same car he'd never once offered to let me drive. I didn't answer when he knocked on the front door. "Amelia," he called. "I know you're here. Your car is in the driveway." I continued painting, adding delicate blue-gray shadows to the waves. "Please just talk to me. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." I mixed a little white paint with the blue, trying to capture the foam of the breaking waves. "I've been trying to reach you for months. I don't understand what I did wrong. what he did wrong, not what he hadn't done, not what he'd failed to notice or acknowledge or care about. What he'd done wrong, as if my departure was punishment for some specific infraction rather than the natural consequence of decades of being invisible. After 20 minutes of shouting and pleading and demanding, Richard finally gave up and left. I finished my painting, pleased with how I'd captured the way morning light danced on the water. That evening, he called from a local hotel. "I'm not leaving until we talk," he said when I finally answered. "Then you're going to be there a long time." "Amelia, please. I love you. I miss you. I want to fix this." "Richard, do you know what kind of cancer I had?" "What?" "The cancer diagnosis report that sat on our kitchen table for a week. Do you know what kind of cancer it was?" It was breast cancer, right?" "What stage?" Silence. "What was my treatment plan?" More silence. "How many chemo sessions did I have?" "Amelia, You don't know, do you? You don't know any of it. Your wife fought cancer for 4 months, and you can't answer a single question about her treatment." "I was scared," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to handle it. So you ignored it. You ignored me. The way you've been ignoring me for years." "That's not true." "Richard, when was my last chemo session?" Silence. "When did I get the all clear from my oncologist?" More silence. "When was the last time you asked me how I was feeling about any of it?" "I'm asking now." 6 months too late. I hung up and turned off my phone. The next morning, the Mercedes was gone. While Richard was stalking me in Cannon Beach, the full consequences of my departure were becoming clear back in Portland. Marcus called me in August with an update that was both satisfying and sad. "Amelia, I need to be honest with you. The transition has been rougher than expected." "How so?" "Richard is struggling with his new role. He's used to being the face of the company, but he doesn't understand the operational details. When clients have technical questions, he can't answer them. When problems arise, he doesn't know how to solve them." I wasn't surprised. Richard had spent so many years focusing on the glamorous aspects of consulting that he'd never learned the nuts and bolts of actually running a business. "We've lost 3 clients in the past month," Marcus continued. "They're frustrated with the lack of continuity and expertise." "What about the employees?" "Most of them are adapting well to the new structure. But they keep asking questions that Richard can't answer, and he's getting defensive about it." I felt a pang of sympathy for the staff who'd worked so hard over the years. They deserved better than to be caught in the middle of this transition. "Marcus, I can offer some additional consulting time to help train Richard and smooth the transition. But I won't work directly with him. Everything goes through you." "That would be incredibly helpful." "Thank you." Over the next few weeks, I developed training materials and process documentation that I should have created years ago. It was strange, finally codifying knowledge I'd carried in my head for decades. Strange, but liberating. For the first time, I could see the full scope of what I'd been doing all those years. No wonder the business was struggling without me. I'd been handling the equivalent of 3 full-time jobs. Meanwhile, my own consulting practice was thriving. Word had spread through the business community about my expertise, and I was getting referrals faster than I could handle them. By fall, I had a waiting list of potential clients and was earning more money working part-time for my beach house than I'd ever made working full-time in Portland. Tom, the farmer I'd met at the market, had become a regular part of my life. We'd started with casual coffee dates and progressed to long walks on the beach, shared dinners, and quiet evenings reading together on my deck. He was everything Richard wasn't: attentive, curious about my thoughts and feelings, genuinely interested in my work and my art. "You know," Tom said one evening as we watched the sunset, "I've never met anyone who talks about their work the way you do. You light up when you're solving problems for your clients." Richard used to say I took business too seriously. Richard was an idiot. I laughed and realized it was the first time I'd laughed about my marriage without bitterness creeping in. It's been 18 months since I placed that cancer diagnosis report on the kitchen table, and 1 year since I moved to Cannon Beach. As I write this final chapter, I'm sitting on my deck watching the sunrise paint the Pacific in shades of gold and pink, my coffee growing warm in my hands as I reflect on how completely my life has transformed. The woman who was once invisible in her own marriage now runs a successful consulting practice from her dream house by the sea. My clients value my expertise and pay me well for it. My art has progressed from terrible to merely bad to actually showing promise. I've had 2 small pieces accepted into local gallery shows, and I'm working toward my first solo exhibition next spring. Tom and I have been talking about the future carefully because we're both old enough to know that love at our age requires different considerations than young romance. But there's something beautiful about finding someone who sees you clearly when you're finally ready to be seen. Richard, I'm told through our children, has found some measure of stability. He's still with Marcus's company in a reduced role, focusing on client relations while leaving the operational details to people who actually understand them. He stopped drinking so much, started therapy, and moved to a smaller apartment that he can actually manage on his own. Sarah and Michael visit me regularly now, and our relationships have deepened in ways I never expected. They see me as a complete person now, not just as their mother or their father's wife. They ask about my paintings, my business, my relationship with Tom. They've started calling just to chat, not because they need something. "Mom," Sarah said during her last visit, "I want to apologize for not seeing what was really happening in your marriage. Sweetheart, you were living your own life. That's what children are supposed to do. Still, I should have noticed how you always knew every detail of Dad's business, how you handled everything behind the scenes. I should have realized you were the real force behind the company's success. You see it now. That's what matters. My cancer remains in remission, monitored carefully, but no longer the terrifying presence it once was. I've learned to see it as the catalyst that saved my life, not because it was life-threatening, but because it showed me how truly alone I was in my marriage. If Richard had noticed that report, if he'd asked questions and shown concern, I might have stayed in that comfortable, suffocating routine forever. His neglect, as painful as it was, became my liberation. Last week, I received a letter that brought this story full circle. It was from a woman named Patricia Chun, no relation to Marcus, just a coincidence of names, who'd read about my journey in a magazine article about women starting over later in life. Dear Ms. Cardoso, I'm writing because your story gave me the courage to make a change I've been contemplating for years. I'm 58 years old and have been married for 32 years to a man who treats me like a very efficient household appliance. Last month, my doctor found some concerning spots on my mammogram, and when I told my husband, he asked if I could schedule my biopsy around his golf tournament. That was my kitchen table moment. I'm writing this from my lawyer's office, where I've just signed papers to buy a small cottage in Vermont. Like you, I'm finally choosing myself. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to start over. With gratitude, Patricia. I cried when I finished that letter, not from sadness, but from recognition. Somewhere, another woman was finding the courage to demand visibility in her own life. Another woman was learning that love isn't just a feeling, it's attention, care, and the daily choice to really see the person beside you. As I finish writing this story, Tom is in the kitchen making breakfast, something Richard never did in 42 years of marriage. In a few minutes, he'll call me inside with genuine excitement to show me something he's discovered in the morning paper, or to share a story from his garden, or simply because he enjoys my company. This afternoon, I'm meeting with a potential new client who specifically sought me out because of my reputation for solving complex organizational problems. This evening, Tom and I are having dinner with Linda and her new boyfriend, a retired professor she met at the library who fell in love with her mind before he even noticed her appearance. Tomorrow, I'm starting a new painting inspired by yesterday's storm, a seascape showing the calm that comes after turbulence, the way morning light looks more precious when you've weathered the darkness. My phone sits beside me, no longer a source of anxiety or obligation. Richard's name was deleted from my contacts months ago. The children call when they want to share news or seek advice, not because they need me to manage some crisis. My consulting clients communicate with respect and appreciation. For the first time in my adult life, my time is truly my own, shared freely with people who value both my company and my contributions. The woman who once waited desperately for her husband to notice her cancer diagnosis now wakes each morning knowing she is seen, valued, and loved, not just by others, but by herself. I was 67 when I finally learned to be visible in my own life. But every day since has been worth the wait. To every woman reading this who feels overlooked, undervalued, or invisible in her own relationships, you have more power than you realize. You have more worth than they're acknowledging. And you have more life ahead of you than you think. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to demand to be seen. It's never too late to start over.
Trust me on this.
I'm living proof. Thank you for following my incredible journey from invisible wife to independent woman living her best life by the sea. If this story of triumph over betrayal resonated with you, please make sure you're subscribed to her true stories and hit that notification bell. Your support means everything to us as we continue bringing you powerful stories of women who refuse to accept less than they deserved. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever felt invisible in your own marriage or relationship? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories inspire our community every day. Remember, it's never too late to rewrite your story. Sometimes the best chapters come after you've finally closed the book on the parts of your life that no longer serve you. Don't forget to like this video if Amelia's story moved you, and share it with any woman in your life who might need to hear that she deserves to be seen, valued, and cherished. Until next time, keep standing strong and never forget your worth.